She's been recognized as one of the world's greatest female leaders. United Nations Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed has risen from humble beginnings in Nigeria to become the UN's most powerful woman. For more than 30 years, she's worked hard to shine a light on the developmental challenges facing our world, particularly women and girls. Prior to joining the UN, Amina Mohammed served under 3 Nigerian presidents as an advisor and Minister of the Environment. As Deputy Secretary General, she's been instrumental in setting and promoting the implementation of the UN's ambitious Sustainable Development Goals. Amina Mohammed has been a strong voice for women's rights at a time when there are concerns the coronavirus pandemic could wipe out decades of progress made towards gender equality in areas like employment, education, physical and mental health. The global health crisis has led to an increase in gender-based violence. From the UK to the US, Australia and Kenya, violence against women is on the rise in nearly every country and has been made worse by lockdown restrictions. And the COVID-19 vaccination campaigns are once again highlighting global inequalities and the profound disparities in wealth, health and education between rich and poor countries. So, what can be done to build back a fair and safe world for women after the struggles and injustices of the pandemic? The Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, talks to Al Jazeera. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much for having me, Folly.
Amina Mohammed, what is the greatest challenge of being a woman in today's world?
Living up to the high expectations of leadership and delivering on what is important for the other half of humanity that has so far been ignored in the past decades. So yes, it's living the reality of expectations and trying to make sure that we deliver.
So what we heard there was from the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Now we want to hear from Amina Mohammed, who grew up with 4 sisters, has 4 daughters, a granddaughter. What do you teach them about the world we live in as women?
Well, first of all, the opportunity, but those opportunities will not come easily because they're not in a position where their rights and equality is a norm. And that's what we're fighting for. But I also teach them the value of them as human beings first, and then as women and partners of men and boys and society, and really the values that we hold strong in our communities and our societies that give women a high place in life. I actually also teach my sons the same thing, and how to value their mothers, their sisters, their friends that are women and girls.
So what is it like for you? Tell us about your experience. What is it like for you as a woman, a Muslim woman of color, navigating the halls of the United Nations, the world's most powerful international body? It has to be a bit difficult.
It is tough, but I think first things first, I'm extremely proud to be a woman of color that is a Muslim. I think that's the first thing, is to be comfortable in your own skin and to project that so that the rest of the millions of women, in fact, billions of women that are not in that position, see you as a sign of possibilities, of opportunities, of hope. And so every day, that's what I strive to do, is to keep the positive side going, that there is hope, that there is a struggle, that we can fight this, we can overcome the many obstacles, whether it is gender-based violence, sitting in a leadership position, and once you claim that space, to keep the space, right. Education, health, all of the issues that we live with day to day.
So when you say it's tough, what do you mean? How tough is it being the most powerful woman at the United Nations?
Well, I think on a day-to-day basis, it is the decisions that you need to take to gain the respect of the position of leadership that you have been given. In the case of the United Nations, I'm fortunate with the Secretary General because he is our feminist in chief. But it is about opening spaces for other women and not to be seen as token, and that because I'm a woman, I'm only speaking about women at the table. No, I'm speaking about a side of the table that is empty and that women have to be there. So I am struggling with cultural and behavioral norms that you have to overcome for people to see the value of women's leadership, capacities, expertise, just as any other man that has had the same opportunity.
Deputy Secretary General, many of the issues affecting and holding back women existed before COVID-19, like endemic violence, which is causing a wave of anger around the world today. Recently, very recently, in fact, Turkey withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, the international treaty to combat violence against women, perhaps under pressure from conservatives who argue the convention harms traditional family values and advocates for LGBT community. So what is your reaction first? And is your organization, the United Nations, the only global agency doing enough when in 2021, countries are abandoning international accords designed to protect women?
Well, I think these two questions. First, it was regrettable, the decision of Turkey to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention. That does not stop us reaching out to try to encourage them to come back in again. The Istanbul Convention is an important instrument that brings the world together. So no matter what a country is doing internally to protect women and to ensure that they don't suffer and live from fear of violence, the international community coming together adds more pressure to get it right for everyone. And if Turkey is succeeding in protecting its women and reducing violence against women to a point of zero, then they are an integral part of the success story. And so part of the Istanbul Convention is about that.
The numbers, Amina Mohammed, don't really show that it's the case. I mean, according to the World Health Organization, at least 38% of women in Turkey are subject to domestic violence. Activists say cases could be far higher, as femicides in Turkey are often filed as suicides. So who is to blame? Our judiciary systems
so then
alone?
All the more reason,
yeah.
All the more reason why Turkey should be in the convention, because this is only going to get further and to zero if you're part of a collective that can do that. And so we really do urge the government of Turkey to come back into the convention, and I believe the Secretary General and UN Women has spoken to it. The other question you asked, are we doing enough? Absolutely. I think that we could do more, but we are all in the various conventions, the tools, the country level work that we do, the programming for many of the programs that we put in place. For instance, we do have the Spotlight Initiative with the European Union across many regions that goes from femicide to gender-based violence to early marriage. So these are issues that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Is it happening fast enough at the scale that it needs to happen? Absolutely not. We need to do so much more, which is why International Women's Day was so important to us this year in underscoring the importance of it, and CSW.
I think you agree with me when I say that tackling violence against women and girls is very much about changing mindsets and shifting the underlying social and cultural norms that perpetuate violence against women. So how do we do that? I mean, how do we change mindsets while also considering important issues like culture and religion and traditions as well?
You know, Folly, as a survivor of gender-based violence, let me tell you, it's not government that is going to stop a woman being in that position. It is about the cultural norms and the social norms. So it is about each of us individually saying no and zero tolerance. It is about our religious leaders, our traditional rulers, our mothers. It is a community and a society effort to do that. It is young people who decide that they don't want a life where there is violence and fear in their community. But that's not to say that we don't have to have the enabling environment that when that happens, there should be implications for it. So, for instance, for me, a law that is put in place when a man perpetuates violence in his home, it is not the woman that goes to look for sanctity somewhere else. It is about the man being removed from the home until he can best come back into that home and that community, and not have a woman living in fear of it. So there are many parts. There is the laws that have to happen. There is the intercultural. So it is an all of society, all of government. What I do believe now needs to happen is every government needs to put in place an emergency response to gender-based violence in their countries.
Amina Mohammed, you talked about yourself being a survivor of gender-based violence, and Black women and other minority women are not only at greater risk, but are also more likely to be sidelined and ignored when they report violence. And there's this argument being made of whether you can disentangle racism and misogyny. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, the good news is that things like apartheid are over, but racism is alive and kicking, and we have seen protests across the world that have demonstrated that, and we do need to make sure that we bring an end to it. It is complex. It is not linear. It is not a one-size-fits-all. It happens and manifests itself differently in different circumstances. And so we have to be proactively anti-racist.
Right, but why has it been so difficult, do you think? Why has it been so difficult to strengthen this global anti-racism discourse? And what can global institutions like the United Nations do better in this, trying to change this?
Well, I think the first thing that we international institutions have to do is walk the talk. In what they do internally, they must have policies, and they must actually demonstrate that these processes and the way that we live, we don't tolerate it. We reject it because it actually is, for us, it's not part of our core values. Now, in doing that, when we get into countries, then we have to work with those countries to identify what some of those root causes are, where the blind spots are. There are many. I mean, unconscious bias is everywhere. And to deal with them, to deal with the behavior, to deal with the culture, to deal with nations who, implicitly have this in the way in which they do business.
Is racism an issue within the United Nations system?
I think, like with every institution, it is, and we are addressing that now with a process that has been put together from our country offices all the way through our agencies and the Secretariat. It is over a year into that process. We have, of course, had feedback where it is happening, where it is unacceptable, and where we are putting in the checks and balances to make sure that we change the culture and that we make sure people are protected and don't go through what we stand against.
All right, let's come back to the issue of women and the coronavirus pandemic. Many gains, the United Nations has said many gains have been made around women's rights in the past few decades, but the pandemic could now wipe out those gains. 25 years of progress towards gender equality. This is certainly very concerning. What are going to be the long-term effects of the pandemic on women and their well-being, and what should be the most urgent issue that we need to address now?
Well, in 2015, Folly, we put in the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, and women were a central part of this in every goal, not just Goal 5 that we have. And that's the measures that we use when we see the COVID exacerbating our progress towards the SDGs. It has put women out of work. It is the burden of the frontline workers. It is excluding them from education, as education was locked down and very few could get online. Gender-based violence in which we saw in some cases 3 times hold. So what do we do about that? I think we have to underpin 5 key areas that we must reinforce through the stimulus packages that are being supported and where they're not calling for financing for that, to have targeted expenditures on equal rights, on representation, on economic inclusion, informal to formal, on gender-based violence, and of course, I think a real focus on what are we going to do now to leapfrog the opportunities that COVID brings for that intergenerational transition and paying more attention to young people, especially young women.
You talked about the SDGs there, and I wonder whether the UN is failing in achieving some of these SDGs, especially those around women's health and their sexual and reproductive rights, because of the politicization of women's health. When we talk about reproductive rights, for example, it's discussed in terms of morality very often. Some countries have made inroads and others haven't. So how do you, as the highest ranking woman at the United Nations, deal with the politicization of women's issues, especially when it comes to things like our health?
I think you have to break it down to basic rights. I mean, the politics should have no place in the rights that women have around their body and the choices that they make. And I think we have to begin to push back and to simplify this basic ask, which is a basic human right and happens to be a woman's right. I think once you start to fail on those rights, you fail on all of them. And it is great to see US leadership with Kamala Harris, who's talking about democracy and the risk to democracy and its stepping back and how critical women are going to be at the center of that. Every day, it is about reinforcing those rights that we have around sexual, reproductive, and health, and what that means in where the gaps are that we need to fill. And this needs to be a cross-aisle issue. This is not an issue for one party or another, for one opposition or another. It is about women. It is about their rights over their bodies and the choices that they make. And it is about, at the end of the day, it's about our humanity.
You mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, you have been the pallbearer, really. You've been the figurehead, really, promoting these Sustainable Development Goals. The list, 17 goals, lofty goals, including eliminating poverty, hunger, ensuring equitable quality education, gender equality, climate action, of course. And they came with a huge price tag, $2 to $3 trillion. That was even before the pandemic. What's the reality now of the situation? I mean, these goals, are they still attainable even after the pandemic? Which one is going to be the most difficult to achieve?
Well, they came as a package. And so I see that, we are perhaps most at risk of losing traction on the gender goal. Because it is a goal that matters to all others. And when we see the investments in the other goals, we don't see the investments that need to be targeted towards women and girls. And so I think the biggest challenge here is to see that investments that go in, how do we measure the results? It should not just be the results of whether healthcare and health systems are up and running, but is the impact of those healthcare services happening in the lives of women and girls? And the same through the whole agenda. This is an opportunity now that we have with COVID, as we look at the stimulus packages, as we try to recover better. It's the responses that we have now that will determine the quality of that build back better. Will we have more girls in school? But those girls in school, will they have opportunity to digital skills, et cetera, et cetera?
What about the climate targets, Amina Mohammed? They seem to be way off target. The UN has held countless meetings and summits on climate change, but it doesn't seem the actions being taken today will be enough to forestall the direct impacts of climate change.
Well, we have a huge year ahead of us. This is a year of nature. This is where commitments need to be made by each and every government on their NDCs. It's where the opportunity, again, of the COVID response can be the green and the blue transitions, and we are pushing that. We are actually seeing a lot of traction. On the net zero commitments, we are over 65%. That's a huge percentage up on where we were last year. We still have a way to go. We are incredibly confident that as we go into the meetings of the G7, the G20, our spring meetings, and the number of international conferences that we have where the world comes to make more commitments, that we will make COP26.
They make the commitments, countries make the commitments, but very often they don't follow through with those commitments.
Well, you're right. There is a reality where people are slipping back, and there is still the aspiration. Every day we work at closing that gap. Now, I can say to you that commitments don't necessarily mean just the commitment towards the net zero of 2050, but it is also how much of your money now will be spent in the bank, for instance, in the World Bank, for instance, on adaptation that matters to developing countries. We want to see 50-50 on that. Is that happening? You can see that by the results of the disbursements that happen through the bank. So I think much more concrete asks about what we expect from the climate agenda. And we're seeing that already. Investments in the Great Green Wall across the Sahel, because there is a big issue there on how we are going to create a more stable and peaceful environment without investing in the Great Green Wall, the economic potentials it brings, the energy transitions that can happen. It doesn't happen. So commitments we can follow fully, not words, but actions.
Right. But sadly, Deputy Secretary General, a lot of countries right now, climate change is really not their priority. Their priority is how to deal with this coronavirus pandemic. And one of the injustices of this pandemic has been the inequity of vaccine distribution, which has become a key part, really, of the conversation in the fight against this global pandemic. The UN Secretary General has said himself that no one is safe unless we're all safe. But COVID-19, as we've seen, is breeding nationalism, and it's, worrying, certainly, and damaging this vaccine nationalism that we're seeing. So what is the solution to equitable vaccine distribution? There's the COVAX initiative, of course, but that's been really slow, especially for African countries.
You're absolutely right. First to say we're not going to address climate separately from equity in vaccines. We can't move ahead with any recovery that is global and inclusive unless we address the issue of vaccines. What has happened with vaccine nationalism is a moral blight on our international community. It should not happen. This is the one global public good in this global pandemic that we should all get behind. We haven't, and we have to do better at that. And this is why the SG Secretary General asks for a global plan in which the G20 can get behind with the resources, addressing the productivity, and that you can produce this not just in wealthy countries, but in countries around the world, building that
But in India, we've seen India and South Africa trying to waive intellectual property rights on COVID-19 vaccines, but they've failed so far. And of course, that alone wouldn't solve the issue of vaccine distribution. But again, it's highlighting trade obstacles related to public health. How do we deal with that?
Well, number one, we have an amazing woman that's just taken office. So let's not say we failed. I'm sure that she's going to be up front and center on this, having been the chair of Gavi and understanding what the pitfalls are and the challenges. We don't give up on this. There are still people's lives to save. The vaccine needs to be in every country equally, and it has to be there urgently. And that's what we work towards.
Okay, I want to talk to you about Nigeria, your home country. Not a day goes by, not a week goes by, I have to say, without news of school children being kidnapped, and particularly girls. Of course, I mean, they are failures at a number of levels. You've served your country in the past. You've served as Minister of the Environment. If you were in a position of leadership in Nigeria today, what would you do differently to address this issue?
I think it's very complex to have a one response answer to Nigeria. When I was Minister of Environment, the issues of conflict were in the Niger Delta with our militants and injustices and exclusion from the economy. They were with Boko Haram. It was injustice. It is criminality where people have no hope and so no alternative. What would I do? I would try to address what these injustices are that are the root causes of what communities themselves in the end turn to, and that we see this proliferation of conflict in all its ramifications. So there must be a real targeting of resources to make sure that young people have an alternative to conflict and violence, and that they have a future in their country. That must happen. Better governance to ensure that resources go to people, young people, jobs, women. On the other hand, we have to strengthen our security systems and leadership across security networks to make sure that they are also inclusive, that they also uphold the law and the rights of people in discharging their duties.
Amina Mohammed, your long and distinguished career has seen you work across the private sector, civil society, both nationally in Nigeria, regionally in Africa, the United Nations. What is next for Amina Mohammed?
Yes, post-United Nations is just to be a really great grandmother and an inspiration to young people and go back and work at the community level. I mean, I've always felt that that is the best place to be.
So you're not interested in entering the political scene in Nigeria?
I've always been best appointed and not elected. I think that space is for other women who can do so much better, and I'd be very happy to support them and get behind them and make sure that there is, the first woman president in Nigeria.
Do you think Nigeria would be better off with a female president?
I do, absolutely. Absolutely. Nigeria with a woman president, it would be great to see. And,
but what about the United Nations?
Hundreds of women.
Yeah, what about the United Nations? In its 75-year history, still no Secretary General, female Secretary General. I mean, there are, of course, 40% women in the UN system, but at the top, there's still not a woman. The UN should be leading by example, should it not be?
It should, and time will come when that will happen. It is an absolute no-brainer that there will be a woman at the helm of this institution in years to come, and sooner rather than later.
Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much for having me.